Hello, and welcome back to another exciting, educational, and exploratory, didn't I do well there, episode of The Library is Open. So I hope you brought your library cards, my dear. I went a bit Fagin at the end there, didn't I? I'm not sure how I feel about that. But anyway, this is take two because my shoes fell off now. Do you know what I mean? This is take two. I'll just get in frame proper. Because I originally filmed this on the front doorstep. I don't know why, I think I had this sort of fantasy about, you know, like a sort of, one of them homes in the deep south where they've got like a really nice sort of like front patio and they sit out there in rocking chairs or something. I mean, it doesn't help that I live in Greater Manchester. But it was just dead noisy. It was just like folk driving up and down constantly and being silly, and it's like, it's supposed to be a lockdown, isn't there, for goodness sake. So there I were with my cup of tea, filming away, and then my phone, while we're filming it on, fell in the ferns. Bit of alliteration there. And they were just all shouting and folk and kids screaming and all that, and I thought no. So I abandoned that and I've come indoors, which is a shame really in many ways, because I'm wearing a right snazzy t-shirt, look, all sorts of drag artists on there, and I've got my lovely sort of what's his face, can't remember his name, sort of like Camden Town little hat thing going on, because as I said in my previous video when I was outside, I don't want my head to burn. I already have skin like soy milk at the best of times. You know, so looking like Red Lobster's the last thing I need right now. But anyway, interesting I should bring up things about patios. Because I suppose in my head that's sort of like a sign of wealth or something, isn't it? So in a very sort of tremulous link, it kind of relates to what I want to talk about today, which is a non-fiction book, which I did haul in my isolation haul 1, and this is, and a lot of people have expressed interest in it, so I decided to make a brief video about it, just because I finished it recently and really enjoyed it. So it's this one, this little number. I'll bring it up to come out. I always want to do what YouTubers do, so like, you know, like, that didn't help you at all, did it? It's called The Shame Game, and it's by Mary O'Hara, and it's subtitled Overturning the Toxic Poverty Narrative. Now, broadly, what this is about is, as you may have guessed from the title, poverty, but also a sort of a class and the class structure in the UK, a lot of which I'm really interested in. You know, a lot of my work is about class and my, well, when I say interest in the class structure, I mean deep and abiding hatred for, in the way that it affects the people who are sort of directly implied by that. Is that the right way to say it? I don't know. Anyway, yeah, so, you know, I have a lot of time for things like that, and I had seen that this was coming out, so I think I got it like the week it came out, from before the whole, you know, lockdown kicked off, when I was still at work. There's a brilliant independent bookshop called News from Nowhere in Liverpool. Well, quite like that fringy bit, it's a bit culture club, innit? Which is a women's collective and independent bookshop, and yeah, it's run as a sort of collective, I think. I'm not sure it's what the setup is there, but it's an admirable thing, you know. And there's a lot of signposting and, you know, groups, community organisations, so on and so forth. So I'd seen that this was coming out, so I went to buy it straight away, and I got it from there. And also, on a personal note, it has a quote from Conrad Murray from Beatbox Academy, that's the art centre, who I have worked with before and is an absolute dream. So that's just another tick in its favour. So Murray, if I can call it that, Murray, who writes from a working class perspective, or a benefits class perspective, which is also a thing, and she's like she was a journalist and she's kind of a researcher now. That's not to denigrate her or anything, I'm just trying to get the specifics right. She wrote a book about, I want to say, how long ago? I should really prepare this in advance, shouldn't I? But I haven't. At some point in the last 10 years, she wrote a book about austerity, basically, which obviously in the UK we've been living with for the past decade. And this is a sort of spiritual sister, I suppose, to that, in the sense that, well, it deals with poverty, what it really is about is looking at the after effects of austerity measures, benefit sanctions, universal credit, so on and so forth, and wrapping that up in how a poverty narrative is created by, the top 5%, that's ultimately based on shame. And she talks about that recurringly as like how people who work in poverty, be they employed or otherwise, are controlled by shame. It's this narrative that's put about that sort of tries to keep people in their place. So, politically there's this idea that, of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, or, go out and get a job, blah, 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 blah. You should be contributing. If you're in poverty, it's your own fault. If you're using food banks, blah, 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 so on and so forth, which, as is patently untrue. And what Mary does is sort of describe how people get away with that because of the shame narrative that stops people speaking out against it. And this is something that's sort of come steadily more into focus since, the 80s with Reagan and Thatcher and so on and so forth, who were very much of the greed is good, there's no such thing as society kind of nonsense viewpoint, where slowly, social welfare and care from the state came to be demonised and seen as, well, it was sold to people as being that supporting other people was essentially stealing out of the taxpayer's back pocket, whereas actually the truth is nothing like that. And it got muddied along the way, obviously, with immigration and asylum seekers and so on and so forth, and so-called low-skilled jobs, which, irony, they're the most important ones right now. So, yeah, it also ties into that, and she's very sort of systematic in how she goes, this happens, and then this happens, and this happens, and added all this together, this creates this web of, I suppose, a sort of sellable way of thinking about people in poverty. Now, having grown up in the 80s and 90s, and very much a part of and supported by the welfare state, this obviously means a lot to me. And as I've said before, I work a lot with ideas around class. My last show, for instance, which I know I bang on about all the time, but hey, this is how I relate to things. My last show was about growing up working class and didn't specifically touch on poverty in this way, but there were lots of bits I recognised from it, both culturally, socially, and obviously financially. And what's really great about the Shame Game, actually, is that Mary O'Hara, she sort of goes out of her way from the very start to say this is not an academic text, which it isn't. But actually, I'd argue that it's more useful than an academic text, and that's not to denigrate like academia. I work in and with academia sometimes, but I think that had it been that, it would be a much easier to ignore, whereas this comes from lived experience, and there's this weird idea that when things are put into academic language, they sort of lose potency, or a grip with reality, which I sort of get as well, because academia is a weird thing, where it's a wonderful thing, but it's a weird thing as well, in the sense that sometimes, not always, sometimes it exists to argue with itself, if that makes sense, and it sort of conveniently forgets that oftentimes what we're talking about when we discuss concepts and stuff is people's real lives. It's the same when we're talking about academic papers about sex work or HIV transmission or anything like that. It's like, yeah, it's interesting to talk about semantics. Took my glasses off now because I'm too cool for school. Well, it is interesting to talk about them philosophically and at a remove. We must never forget that we're discussing people's real life experience, And I think that's what Mary O'Hara does really, really well. So she draws on a lot of sources. I think it was about 2 years she took to research this, and she went out and met loads of people from the UK and America, where she uses the UK and America as her basis for talk, because she says despite their reputations as really wealthy countries, they have the largest disparities in wealth of the richest countries, in terms of between the very poor and the very rich. And she finds that fascinating because she sort of draws that with draws that into the connection of, draws that into, or makes a connection with, you know, the idea of the UK and the US's special relationship, which obviously had its own complex problems with, you know, Iraq and, you know, the terrorism of the late 90s, early 2000s. And, you know, so she talks to a lot of really interesting people who are or have been homeless, are living currently in poverty, are using food banks, and she sort of talks about how, you know, how precarious the majority of us are in terms of most of us, one paycheck. I don't know why we say paycheck, because it's not really a check anymore, is it? We are one monthly payment away from experiencing extreme poverty. And, you know, having to access social care services. So actually, our toes are far closer to the line than we'd maybe like to think they are sometimes. But yeah, so that's really interesting. What is really, really interesting about Mary's work as well, I'll put them back on now. What is really interesting about her work is how she describes the use of language and what she calls, well, it's not what she calls, it's a concept called framing, which I am going to interpolate into my teaching, actually, because obviously I work with words. So I think this is important and shows you the power of them. And she uses the example of climate change, which I hadn't really stopped to think about before until I read it in here, but she talks about how climate change is now what we call global warming. However, global warming has been reframed, and here's why. Because global warming sounds threatening, and it sounds like something we should really do something about, change our habits, change our behaviours, blah, 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 overturn things that we regularly access in the market, and think, maybe we shouldn't be doing that, actually, that there are better ways to treat the planet. However, that disrupts arrangements that prop up capitalism, supply and demand. So somebody very cleverly in politics, she doesn't go into specifics of who, but you don't have to be, you know, Einstein to try and work it out, goes, you know what, global warming sounds, let's reframe the conversation. And if you've ever seen Mad Men, which, by the way, is a brilliant series, it is on Netflix at the moment, or you can probably stream it, where Don Draper talks about changing the conversation. That's what framing is, basically. It's like, if you don't like how the conversation's going, change it. They go, actually, climate change is a better word, because climate sounds natural, sounds, you know, very sort of body shoppy, sounds like a naturally occurring process that we have nothing to do with, we can't be held responsible for. Change, correlation is, change can be good, all for the best, everything changes, blah, blah. So we put it together and we've gone from global warming to climate change. You know, and I think what's really clever there is that you can already, she doesn't even just tell you, but you can straight away apply that to things like austerity or universal credit, which, let's face it, is anything but. Food bank, which, you know, let's call it what it is. It's a poverty handout because of the mismanagement of the economy. And I thought that was just so interesting, because that's all part of this toxic poverty narrative, isn't it? Not only does it encourage people to feel ashamed of themselves if they have to access social services, what it also does is make the government, even while they're taking with one hand and giving with another, look benevolent. Universal credit. Yeah, as if it's across the board and it's just this sort of very kind thing that has nothing to do with anything else, and it's not at all. So yeah, another thing Mary does is talk about the way that, you know, TV and the newspapers, particularly the Daily Mail and the Sun, things like that, get behind this idea of talking about scrounging. Scroungers versus strivers, she discusses it as. And, you know, on telly you get things like Benefit Street, or, you know, those sort of documentaries that show basically people living on benefits and what we're all supposed to do is jump on Twitter afterwards and say, disgusting, they shouldn't get a penny off the state, blah, 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 and all this, while, sort of carefully ignoring that the programmes are very heavily edited and created with the specific purpose of making you mad. It's like, if you're upset after them, you're supposed to be. So it talks about how the media is complicit in that. And why is the media complicit in that? Because it's owned by wealthy people. So again, they change the narrative and the story, and they dictate what the plot points are along the way. So in a way, they're basically narrating our experience of it. She also talks to people who are attempting to fight back against this shaming and demonisation. She talks to artists, activists, charities, and also children and young people. That's where Conrad comes in with Beatbox Academy, which is a sort of youth and community provision that allows young people to express themselves through the medium of beatboxing. And there's some examples in here of poems they've written, and I say poems, spoken word and so on and so forth that they've written in response. And this is again what's interesting, because she's not just sort of talking about problems, she's talking about solutions as well. And with a realistic slant, recognising that articulating solutions doesn't mean they're necessarily going to catch on, because again, it's about us who are waging against toxic poverty narratives, recreating another story and popularising that. So we're reframing as well, we're constantly reframing. Let's try and look through, see what I've missed, because I feel like I'm just trying to give an overview, really, because you can't really describe this kind of book in that many words. You just have to sort of read it, I guess, or if it's something you're interested in. But yeah, I found it interesting in terms of just to lead back to work again, I suppose, in terms of how much of, I suppose, factual understanding about things is constructed through story. I read a quote once, and I can't for the life of me remember who it was, and it's really annoying, I should probably Google it, which was like, you can't convince people with statistics, you have to use stories, because of how stories are constructed to appeal to humans, and how they are so effective in how they help us make use of the world, deal with crises. They're a form of catharsis, a panacea, a way of exploring concepts and ideas, and also a way of finding empathy with other people. All of which is what plays do. So I found the bits about storytelling really, really interesting, and it's also nice that that she sort of talks about storytelling as, it doesn't have an allegiance, it can be used for good or evil, by whomever's wielding it and whoever knows how to use it effectively. There again, all pours back into this language that is so powerful when used in the right way to get what you want. There's a really interesting bit which talks about, because Mary O'Hara was the first in her family to go to university, as was I. Drama school, but it was a degree. And she talks about, she went to Cambridge, and it's a pretty horrible encounter there with some proper, the kind of people who burnt that £50 note in front of that homeless man. Absolute morons who, I'd swear more, but, this is the family channel. Since when? And it took me back a little bit, because when I was in 4th year at school, at high school, I should say, we went to, I think it was Cambridge. Was it Cambridge? Yeah. They took us to Cambridge, like people that, I think there's about 8 of us that were sort of, I don't know, predicted to do really well in our GCSEs, but it was a bit sort of like, come and have a look around Cambridge, whatever. Which I presume, looking back in hindsight, was probably Cambridge's way of doing, like, outreach for poor kids. And I don't know, even then at the time, I got this sense of, this is what you could have won. Because as Mary says in the book, statistically, it's very unlikely that a lot of children born into working class, benefit class, underclass, they're not my terms, by the way, they're sociological terms, by people who've lived them. Of going, the likelihood of them actually going to Oxbridge is, minute still, despite the fact that it's allegedly open, because I think because it's a different life, isn't it? It's a different expectation of what life looks like. It's a different way of having to keep up. It's a whole culture of, I went to Durham once, and Durham's kind of like where people go if they don't go to Oxford and Cambridge. So it's like a sort of mini version of that, I suppose, the University of Durham. And, I remember just being sort of transfixed by the formality of it and the culture of the education there and the balls and all these kind of, sort of quite cliched things that you think about higher education in the past that still exist there. And I never visualised that I'd ever go to Cambridge or Oxford. I mean, thankfully, I never wanted to because, they don't really do anything that I specialise in. But, yeah, it was sort of a bit like, have a little look at this and then be on your merry way back. I remember thinking even the graffiti wasn't swearing. It was really well phrased. It was all philosophy. I'm aware that I'm editorialising now, but that's what it felt like. So do I recommend this book? Yeah, I do. Oh, it's also got a quote from my friend Kat Woodson, who's a brilliant playwright who wrote the play Killymuck. She wrote quite a few, actually. I think she's on attachment to the BBC Writers' Room now, I want to say. And she's a Northern Irish playwright and definitely worth checking out. That's Kat with a K, Woods. But I definitely recommend this, I think, because it's not only about poverty, it's also about how entire political systems are written, rewritten, and focused to make you think certain things or to make you toe the party line, as it were, which, is particularly pertinent now. So, yeah, I definitely recommend checking out if any of that sounds interesting to you. It's a nice, easy read. I got through it in about 3 days, although she's fairly thick. Yeah, let's just keep amplifying these voices of people that are living, as many of us are, these really precarious existences and need our support and our empathy, not demonisation. So, yeah, that's The Shame Game, Mary O'Hara. And that's it for this episode. So it's goodbye. See that? That was rude. So it's goodbye from me. I'll take my glasses off one last time to look smoulderingly at you. It's goodbye from me with my special art and my Culture Club fringe and my snazzy t-shirt. Put those library cards safe and keep them clean for next time. You can disinfect them because they're probably laminate. Keep on turning those pages. Keep sending me suggestions, your comments, your gifts, your memes, your essays, life stories, etc. What your mum did on her holiday. Do look after yourself. Do be safe. And I hope you're all doing all right. Much love as always.